I recently found myself at a crowded gallery opening, listening to a prominent cultural critic explain a new art installation. He was incredibly articulate, practically radiating confidence as he wove a dazzling web of complex terms, speaking of discursive frameworks, liminal spaces, and ontological resistance. The crowd around him nodded in a sort of hypnotic trance, everyone terrified to admit they had no idea what he was actually saying. To the observer, it looked like a profound display of high intelligence, a perfectly curated brand of sophistication. But then, the atmosphere shifted. A young student interrupted the monologue with a simple, grounded question. But is the structure stable? Does the math actually hold it up? The critic's reaction was immediate and telling. The charisma vanished. He didn't offer a calculation or a proof. Instead, he became visibly annoyed, sneering at the question as reductive, and retreated instantly back into a thicker fog of abstract jargon. It became obvious in that split second that his complex vocabulary wasn't a tool to explain the world. It was a fortress built to hide the fact that he wasn't really saying anything at all. That moment of defensive obscurity is the perfect lens through which to understand the tragedy of Hypatia. She was the exact inverse of that modern critic. She didn't wear the costume of the intellectual, she stripped it away. She didn't build flip dresses of theory or identity. She taught the undeniable, testable reality of geometry and the stars. And while the confused performer is rewarded today for his obscurity, Hypatia's absolute, unadorned clarity was considered so dangerous by the noisy narcissists of her time that they didn't just argue with her, they dragged her into the street and tore her apart. So that story, that clash between the critic with all his jargon and this simple demand for, testable reality, that really sets the stage for this entire deep dive.
It really does.
We're going to be tracking this huge, and I think often insidious shift. How so much of the academic world and then the public sphere has sort of drifted away from that hard, measurable clarity that someone like Hypatia stood for.
Right.
And moved toward an environment where, where theoretical obscurity is often the fastest way to get ahead.
Or sometimes the only way. It's a huge transition, and it's one that I think affects everyone, whether you're in academia or not. We're sort of shifting from a philosophy that's rooted in, let's call it presence.
Presence. What do you mean by that?
Well, what can be observed, what you can measure, what you can test in the world around you. We're moving from that to a culture that's defined by performance.
Performance.
Yeah. What can be theorized, what can be renamed, what can be defended with just more and more layers of jargon. So for this, we've looked at sources that help us trace the historical forces behind this shift.
From the early 20th century all the way to now.
Exactly. From this intense quest for absolute logical rigor to its philosophical collapse, and then finally to the modern institutional pressures that almost demand intellectual fog. We're really asking, when did clarity stop being a virtue? And why? Okay,
let's unpack that. I think we have to start where you said all true clarity begins, with a direct encounter with reality.
Which brings us back to Hypatia.
Right. Hypatia, teaching in Alexandria around, 410 AD, her whole method was the complete inverse of that critic I mentioned. She wasn't using theory as camouflage. She didn't teach theory in our sense. She taught math as a direct encounter with the world.
Precisely. She was a mathematician, an astronomer, a Neoplatonist philosopher, and her whole methodology, her core work, was centered on structure, proportion, and clarity. The knowledge she was dealing with, it wasn't something you could negotiate based on your identity or, your linguistic preferences.
It just was.
It just was. Her geometry was Euclidean. Her calculations of how the planets moved, which she often did with an astrolabe she helped refine, they were built on direct contact with reality.
And the beauty of that, I think, is that her equations had real empirical stakes.
Absolutely. I mean, if your geometry for building a monument was wrong, the monument falls down. If your observation for navigating a ship was off, the ship sinks.
There are consequences.
Immediate, undeniable consequences. Her truths had a concrete shape. Anyone could test them. Anyone could confirm them if you were willing to do the work. That definition of a circle, it was a universal truth, totally indifferent to all the political and religious chaos that was swirling around her.
It's just such a stark contrast to the academic world we see described in some of our source material, like the story about the sociology student.
Oh, that anecdote is perfect. It just captures the whole thing.
Yeah, his clear, data-driven chapter on poverty gets rejected over and over by his committee. And what was the reason? It was naive and lacking theoretical texture.
They were basically telling him his clarity was a weakness. They wanted him to replace his simple observations. Things like, people move out of bad housing when they get more money, with jargon.
Things like performative discursive ontology or hegemonic spatiality.
Exactly. And that whole phenomenon, that's what we're calling the inverse intellectual. Hypatia was dangerous because she was rooted in the ground. Her teaching was about clarification. It wasn't about marketing a brand or an identity. It just clarified reality.
But the moment you move away from that,
The moment you move from that grounded clarity to the, let's say, the performance of a modern seminar, you're not dealing with truth anymore. You're dealing with an elite linguistic ritual. And success in that world isn't about revealing how the world works. It's about proving you've mastered the secret language that shields your ideas from any simple empirical test.
which makes you wonder how we got here. Because the 20th century actually saw this massive, almost fanatical attempt to do the opposite, to institutionalize Hypatia's spirit.
You're talking about the rise of analytic philosophy.
Exactly. It was all about championing clarity, rigor, argument, precision. Treating philosophy more like a science than like poetry.
It's fascinating because the movement really did start with these incredibly noble, almost utopian intentions. The goal was to just cleanse philosophy of all its ambiguity. And the figure everyone points to as the father of the movement is Gottlob Frege.
A German geometry professor, right? A logician.
Yeah, and he was obsessed with establishing objective, unadorned truth, especially in math.
So what was his big breakthrough? What did he do that let philosophy get so rigorous?
Well, his big contribution was developing modern predicate logic. He laid it all out in his 1879 work, Begriffsschrift.
Concept scripts.
Right, and this wasn't just a small tweak, it was a complete revolution. The old logic from Aristotle could only really handle simple statements like, all men are mortal.
Subject, predicate, stuff.
Exactly, but Frege's logic introduced things like quantifiers for all x. There exists an x and relations like x is greater than y.
Okay, so you could suddenly map out much more complex relationships, the kind you'd actually find in a mathematical proof or a really complex philosophical argument?
Precisely. It gave philosophers a tool that was sharp enough to cut through the surface grammar of language and analyze its deep logical structure. For the first time, really.
And a big part of his project was just defending the objectivity of math, wasn't it? He was fighting the idea that numbers are just feelings or private ideas.
He was fighting a specific idea called psychologism. It was a popular view in Germany at the time that mathematical concepts came from private, individual mental acts. You know, how I happen to group objects, how I count things.
My personal experience of two-ness.
Right. And Frege just fiercely argued against this. He insisted that concepts like the number 2 or the law of contradiction are public objects. They're independent of any one person's mind.
So he's basically making an argument for a kind of mathematical Platonism. The idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is true, objectively, whether or not a human is there to think about it.
That's a great way to put it. He separated the act of thinking about a concept from the concept itself. And that demands clarity. It demands universality. This is also why many people, like Michael Dummett, trace what's called the linguistic turn in philosophy straight back to Frege.
That seems like a leap. How does his work on objective numbers lead to philosophy getting obsessed with language?
It's through what he called the context principle. It's a simple rule. Never ask for the meaning of a word in isolation, but only in the context of a proposition.
Okay.
Frege realized that you could solve these really deep, fuzzy metaphysical problems not by looking inward, but by rigorously analyzing the language we use to talk about them. The moment you decide to solve problems by analyzing linguistic structure, instead of through, subjective introspection, you've made the linguistic turn. You're looking for clarity in the system, not in consciousness.
And this whole quest for certainty in structure, it really hit its peak in the early 20th century. People genuinely believed they could create a perfect logical language.
They did, free from all the ambiguities of human speech that caused so much confusion. And they had a major champion in Bertrand Russell.
Right. Russell saw Frege's logic and just ran with it. He thought it was the key to unlocking the true structure of philosophical problems that were hidden by our sloppy everyday language.
He really did.
Can you give us a classic example of how he used this new logical tool to just dissolve a puzzle?
I mean, the quintessential example, the one everyone points to, is his theory of definite descriptions.
From On Denoting, 1905.
Exactly. The puzzle he was tackling was about sentences like, the present king of France is bald. The problem is, okay, if the sentence is meaningful, then the subject, the present king of France, must refer to something.
But there is no king of France.
Right. So how can this sentence mean anything? It seems to imply that non-existent things have to exist in some weird abstract way, which is a huge metaphysical headache.
Yeah, that's a mess.
So Russell used predicate logic to show that the sentence isn't what it looks like. It's not a simple subject-predicate statement. He showed it's actually a complex assertion with 3 parts.
Okay, what are they?
First, there is an X who is king of France. Second, there is only one X who is king of France. And third, that X is bald.
And if the first part is false?
Which it is, because no such X exists, then the entire proposition is false. But it's still perfectly meaningful because its parts refer to concepts we understand. It was seen as this huge triumph of logic just dissolving a philosophical problem that had led to centuries of obscure arguments.
And this commitment to objective, verifiable clarity, this gets taken to an absolute extreme by the logical positivists.
Oh, absolutely. The logical positivists coming out of the Vienna and Berlin circles in the late 1920s, they basically weaponized this commitment. Their goal was to make philosophy as rigorous and as empirically sound as physics.
And their weapon was the verification principle.
That was their ultimate test for what counted as meaningful knowledge.
So let's nail that down. What did that principle actually say?
It said that for any statement to be meaningful, it had to be one of 2 things. First, it could be analytic, so a truth of logic or math. A tautology, true by definition.
Like all bachelors are unmarried.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you anything new about the world. Or, second, it had to be synthetic, which meant it had to be an empirical claim that you could, at least in principle, test through observation.
So if you couldn't prove it with math or test it with science, it was just out.
It was thrown out. It was a complete purge of traditional philosophy. The positivists just dismissed metaphysics, theology, ethics, aesthetics. They said it was all cognitively meaningless.
They weren't even saying it was false.
No, that was the key. They were saying it was literal nonsense. It failed to convey any verifiable information. According to them, philosophy's only job was the clarification of thoughts.
I remember reading about their critique of Heidegger.
Yes, Rudolf Carnap famously singled out statements from the continental philosopher Martin Heidegger, like the nothing-noths. For a positivist, that's the absolute epitome of philosophical confusion. It sounds deep, maybe, but it fails the verification test. It conveys 0 cognitive meaning. It was the ultimate commitment to that Hypatia-like clarity.
But that level of rigor, it was just so extreme, it had to start collapsing under its own weight.
It was completely unsustainable. The retreat from that kind of absolute clarity was, I think, inevitable. And the first crack, arguably, came from Russell's own student, Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Right, in the Tractatus, his early work.
Which was really the peak of this whole idea. He thought he had solved all philosophical problems by creating this perfectly clear, logical language, but the book has this incredible paradox at the end.
It undermines itself.
It does.
Yeah.
He concludes that all of his own propositions are ultimately meaningless. They're like a ladder you have to kick away once you've climbed up it. And that final sentence is just chilling. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
So even the guy who pushed for perfect clarity ended up concluding that the most important things are beyond the reach of that system.
Exactly. And then the later Wittgenstein, in his philosophical investigations, does a complete 180. He gives up on creating an ideal language and starts analyzing language as we actually use it.
Ordinary language philosophy.
Right. He starts talking about language games, the different ways we use words in different contexts. It was a huge softening of that original rigid quest for formal clarity.
But the real death blow to logical positivism came from America. You're talking about W.V.O. Quine.
Quine's 1951 paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. It's often called the most important philosophy paper of the 20th century because it just blew up the core assumption of the positivists.
Which was the analytic-synthetic distinction. The idea that you can neatly separate truths of definition from truths of fact.
Yes, and that distinction was everything to them, because if you can't cleanly separate truths of logic from truths of experience, the whole verification principle just falls apart.
So what was Quine's argument?
He argued for something called confirmation holism. He said that our knowledge isn't a collection of individual facts that you can test one by one. It's a vast interconnected web, or a field of force. And when you test something, you're testing the whole web at once.
Can you give us an example of how that works in practice?
Sure. Think about physics. Let's say scientists find some tiny persistent anomaly in the orbit of Mercury. They have choices. Do they reject the observation, the synthetic truth? Or do they say, well, maybe Newton's law of gravity needs a little tweak, the analytic or systemic truth?
Right.
Quine's point was that there's no fundamental boundary between those two. Scientists make adjustments to the web of belief wherever it's most convenient or least disruptive to the whole system.
So if that foundation collapses, if you can't neatly divide logic from fact, then the entire positive rejection of metaphysics is invalid. And all that stuff they threw out, essence, identity, goodness, it all comes flooding back in.
And it absolutely did. The second half of the 20th century saw this huge revival of metaphysics. You have figures like Saul Kripke, whose book Naming and Necessity was a game changer.
And Kripke was explicitly arguing against the idea that philosophy is just about analyzing language.
He was. He brought back concepts like essence and necessity as real features of the world, not just features of our language. He used the idea of rigid designators, that a name like Aristotle refers to the same individual in all possible worlds, to show that necessity is a metaphysical fact, not just a linguistic one.
So the pendulum just swung all the way back.
It swung wildly. That intense early pursuit of clarity, it just broke down, not because the goal was wrong necessarily, but because the very foundations of how they tried to achieve it turned out to be flawed.
And this philosophical collapse, this new theoretical freedom, it leads us directly into the modern institutional era where the problems aren't just conceptual anymore, they're structural.
That's the perfect link. The moment philosophy retreated from that hard-edged positivist rigor and Quine blurred the lines, a theoretical vacuum was created. And academic nature, you could say, abhors a vacuum. This is where you start to see institutional incentives that almost guarantee a flight into abstraction.
Which brings us squarely to the tyranny of publish or perish.
The iron law of academia.
It's a cliche, but it's true. Your career tenure, promotion, grants, it's all based on your scholarly output.
And it's measured by very specific, quantifiable things: journal prestige, impact factors, citation counts, and getting past a very overworked peer review system. You have to publish constantly because that's the system's way of certifying that you're a serious researcher.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a meritocracy. You do good work, you get rewarded. But here's the paradox you mentioned. Universities demand this high volume of publications.
Right, often one or two big books for tenure in the humanities.
But the market makes it incredibly hard to publish that kind of specialized, rigorous academic work.
That is the core contradiction. University presses, the traditional gatekeepers for this kind of research, are under unbelievable financial pressure. Library budgets have just cratered when it comes to buying individual books or monographs.
They're spending all their money on huge, expensive journal subscription bundles instead?
Exactly. So a university press might spend, say, $25,000 to produce a young scholar's first book, but they might only sell 300 copies and bring in $15,000. They're losing money.
Which forces them to start acting like commercial publishers.
They're forced to act like trade publishers. They have to look for books with broad market appeal just to stay afloat. They're focused on the bottom line, not just pure academic rigor.
So that deeply specialized study, the one that might be a massive contribution to a tiny field, gets pushed aside for a book that might sell 5,000 copies to a general audience.
It does. Our sources give specific examples of this. An English professor was told flat out that a press, quote, no longer publishes in literary criticism. Niched areas like linguistics or very specific historical topics, they're often the first to go because they just don't meet that commercial threshold.
This puts the young scholar in an impossible bind. If you have to publish a book to get tenure, but the presses only want marketable books, you're forced to distort your own research.
You're under immense pressure to shorten texts, popularize arguments, and minimize scholarly apparatus. The market wants one thing, your promotion committee wants another. It's a catch-22 that almost guarantees intellectual schizophrenia. Your most brilliant, specialized work might be deemed unpublishable, even if it's a masterpiece.
And this is exactly where the system starts rewarding obscurity over clarity. The language becomes a shield. We see this perfectly in that tenure trap anecdote you mentioned about the sociologist Sarah.
Sarah's story just lays the whole mechanism bare. She does this clear empirical research on urban poverty. It gets rejected over and over. Why? Too descriptive? Insufficiently theoretical?
No. She recognized the trap. The data was clear, but the institution didn't see clarity as intellectual work.
So she figured out the solution. She buried the exact same data under layers of deliberately dense, specialized jargon.
She starts talking about socio-temporal fractures and the hermeneutics of scarcity.
And the manuscript, same data, just with that linguistic camouflage, gets accepted immediately, gets published, and she gets tenure. The content didn't change at all. Only the language did.
She realized she wasn't being rewarded for helping people understand the world. She was being rewarded for proving she was in an exclusive club that spoke a secret language.
That's the core insight. The institution actively rewards theoretical obscurity because it's a barrier to entry. In this context, jargon isn't for precision, it's a status marker. It proves you're a member of the elite club. The system rewards the linguistic performance more than it rewards clear communication or problem solving. It's the inverse intellectual in action.
But doesn't this pressure to be marketable also clash with the pressure to be rigorous and use elite jargon? It feels like the system is pulling in two opposite directions at once.
It absolutely is. And the result is what you could call a bean counting mentality. It's all about quantity over quality. Since that one big, rigorous book is so hard to publish and might not be enough output anyway, researchers are incentivized to chop up one big project into lots of little papers.
Salami slicing.
Salami slicing, just to get the number on their CV up.
So the raw count of publications becomes the only metric that matters.
Yes, and we have documented cases of this. A professor was denied tenure even though she published one article in the absolute top journal in her field. She argued that the article was so substantial it could have easily been 3 separate papers.
But they didn't care.
They dismissed it. She just didn't have the right count.
This obsession with quantity must have just catastrophic effects on quality control. If everyone's trying to publish more and more, the system has to be flooded.
The consequences are dire. You get an explosion in the number of academic journals, which means the integrity of peer review starts to break down. Worse, it creates a market for journals with ill intentions, so-called predatory e-journals.
These are the ones that exist just to charge authors huge fees to get published.
Exactly. They'll charge thousands of dollars, bypass any real peer review, and just give you the publication you need to pad your CV. The whole system is forcing people to chase numbers, which makes the research weaker and opens the door to outright fraud.
And even when universities say they're trying to reform, to value teaching more, the reality doesn't seem to match the rhetoric.
No, the evidence shows the publication hurdle is still the most important thing. You mentioned the cases in Ohio and Maryland where state legislatures tried to force public universities to increase teaching loads.
Right, because of public anger over professors not being in the classroom.
But the tenure requirements, the actual metrics for evaluation, they didn't change to account for that. So professors were put in this impossible spot: do what the state wants and teach more, or do what the university really wants and publish more. And those who bet on teaching excellence often perished.
That Connecticut Supreme Court case where a professor won nearly $13 million. That's a powerful example.
A stunning example. The university told her she'd be evaluated on one standard with an emphasis on teaching, but then they denied her tenure based on a different, hidden standard. Not enough publications.
It just shows that the structural bias is against teaching, against clarity, against anything that isn't measured by that bean counting system.
And when your intellectual class is driven away from reality and into abstract performance by this kind of institutional fear, those abstract methods, they inevitably escape the ivory tower.
And that takes us to the final and I think most chilling consequence: the replication crisis and the rise of post-truth discourse. This is where the academic habits start to infect the town square.
The abstraction that started as a status symbol now becomes a rhetorical tool to undermine empirical reality in public life.
That failure is just perfectly captured in that third anecdote we looked at, the story of the city council meeting.
It's terrifying. You have a civil engineer presenting hard, undeniable data. Soil erosion, bridge load-bearing capacity. I mean, this is the physics that holds the world up. This is Hypatia's world.
And he's successfully rebutted by a political organizer
who doesn't challenge the math. Instead, he borrows the language of critical theory. He dismisses the engineer's facts as Western linear logic and empirical absolutism. He says the data excludes the lived truth and the narrative of the community.
The rhetorical tools used to deconstruct a novel are now being used to deconstruct physics in a government meeting.
The boundary has collapsed. When your intellectual systems reward obscurity and subjectivity, you are handing philosophical ammunition to anyone who wants to reject an inconvenient empirical truth.
And this environment is the perfect breeding ground for the era of post-truth,
which we can define as the outcome of extreme hyperpolarization and the rise of alternative media ecosystems. And the core legitimacy of these systems often comes from actively questioning the objectivity of mainstream institutions. The press, the government, even science itself.
And this is reinforced by some very deep psychological mechanisms. You're talking about motivated reasoning.
Yeah, this isn't just about what media you choose to consume. It's about your political identity, causing you to reject proven facts if those facts contradict your group's narrative.
So if a scientific fact, like the data on climate change, threatens my political identity or my community's economy, I become ideologically primed to reject not just the facts, but the source of the facts.
Precisely. The problem isn't a lack of clarity in the information. It's an active rejection of clarity because the person is ideologically opposed to what that clarity implies. This is a huge shift from Hypatia's world, where geometry was universal. Today, trust in academia and science has been so systematically undermined that even the clearest facts can be ineffective if the source is seen as an enema.
And the problem is made even worse by a deep crisis within science itself. The institutional pressures we just talked about have corroded the very foundation of empirical research, leading directly to the replication crisis.
The replication crisis is just this observed, widespread inability to reproduce the findings of scientific studies using new, independent data. It's a massive systemic flaw, and it's a direct consequence of publish or perish. The pressure to publish novel and positive results incentivizes researchers to cut corners.
Let's look at the data on this because it is truly shocking. Many fields, psychology, neuroscience, economics, are operating with dangerously low statistical power. What does that actually mean for the results we read?
Statistical power is the probability that your test will correctly detect an effect if that effect is real. A good, rigorous study should aim for 80% power. But meta-analyses have found that on average, psychology studies have a statistical power of somewhere between 33 and 36%.
That's abysmal. You have a 2/3 chance of missing a true effect, even if it's there.
It's worse than that. When you factor in all the questionable research practices, low power makes any positive result you find highly suspect. One analysis of 200 meta-analyses found that the median number of studies with adequate power was less than 10%.
Wow.
This means a published positive result often has less than a 10% chance of actually replicating. It's basically scientific gambling.
And this reality forces researchers into these questionable research practices, or QRPs, just to survive.
Yeah.
These are like the modern statistical version of intellectual fog.
The two most famous are p-hacking and harking. P-hacking is when you manipulate your data analysis to force a statistically significant result, that magic p-value of less than 0.05.
How would you do that?
Well, you might stop collecting data the second you hit the threshold. Or you might run 5 different statistical tests on your data and only report the one that gave you the result you wanted.
So you're not testing a hypothesis, you're just torturing the data until it confesses.
That's a great way to put it. The results look rigorous, but the method is completely unsound. And then you have harking. That's hypothesizing after the results are known.
Okay, what's that?
That's when you find something purely by accident in your data, an unexpected correlation, and then you rewrite the whole front end of your paper to pretend that this accidental finding was the original hypothesis you set out to prove all along.
In other words, you shoot an arrow at a wall and then draw the target around where it landed.
A perfect summary. And surveys show this is rampant. Around half of researchers admit to harking. About 94% of psychologists admit to using at least one questionable practice. The institutional pressure makes these shortcuts almost a necessity for survival.
And this combination of QRPs and low power also leads to this positive effect size bias.
Yes. When a weak, underpowered study manages to get a positive result, that result is statistically likely to be a massive overestimation of the real effect. It's an intellectual mirage. So when a bigger, better-powered study comes along to replicate it, the effect shrinks or just vanishes completely. It's a self-reinforcing cycle of unreliable results, all driven by the need to publish something novel and significant.
The crisis is clearly systemic. But the good news, I guess, is that recognizing the flaw has led to some serious talk about how to fix it, how to restore some discipline.
And the solutions all focus on valuing rigor over novelty.
The most promising reform seems to be result-blind peer review.
It's a brilliant idea because it completely flips the incentive structure. With this method, studies are accepted for publication based purely on the quality of their methodology and their theoretical justification. And this acceptance happens before they even collect the data.
So the review is on the plan, not the outcome. A researcher gets the published checkmark before they even know if the result is positive or negative.
That's the core of it. It totally removes the incentive for p-hacking and harking because the outcome doesn't matter for acceptance anymore. And the early data on this is stark. In the traditional system, maybe 5 to 20% of studies report a null result. With result-blind review, it's 61%.
61%.
That huge difference shows just how distorted the old model is. It's biased toward publishing sensational-looking results that are often just statistical noise.
That 61% null rate, that is the sound of discipline being restored. It means the science is being driven by good questions, not by pressure to find a shiny new thing.
And beyond these systemic reforms, there are also crucial educational ones, like integrating replication attempts directly into university courses.
That would be a huge shift. Instead of always making students find something original, which is often impossible, you have them focus on validating existing work.
Exactly. Your methods courses should be about doing supervised replication attempts. It teaches scientific methodology in a really rigorous, hands-on way, and just as importantly, it generates a ton of valuable, independent replication data. It helps clean up the entire field.
So this whole long journey, from Hypatia's insistence on testable geometry through this philosophical quest for absolute clarity to its collapse and now this modern crisis of verification, it really shows how easily our knowledge systems can trade grounded reality for abstraction and institutional rewards.
And that final reflection is really what we have to take away from Hypatia's tragedy. Her refusal to separate observation from reason, to separate thought from life, is a model of intellectual presence we desperately need today. She didn't ask for blind faith. She only asked for the courage to look at reality and see what was undeniably there.
The modern intellectual often relies on abstraction, on models and theories that are shielded by these thick walls of jargon. They're safe because you can't easily test them or prove them wrong. Hypatia just refused to play that game.
She understood that clarity is hard work. It requires discipline. Her simplicity wasn't born from ignorance. It was the product of immense rigor.
And in that context, clarity isn't just a style. It's a profound risk.
It is. It leaves nowhere to hide. There's no room for intellectual weakness or contradiction. It's the one thing that distinguishes real, grounded thinking from mere performance. Her legacy is the necessary challenge to any system, ancient or modern, that's built on the safety of infinite meaning and institutionalized fear.